It begins as so many tragedies do in a room that should have been safe. The clock on the wall reads 1:30 in the morning. The faint light of the television paints the ceiling with slow, flickering shapes. Outside, the street lamps buzz, pale halos in a misty Toronto suburb. Inside, a man lies half asleep on a sagging sofa, one hand resting on his chest, the other dangling toward the carpet, where a half-finished mug of tea has gone cold. His name is Kenneth James Parks. He is 23 years old, broad-shouldered, gentle by nature, exhausted by life. The television hums with the laughter of a studio audience. A rerun of Saturday Night Live trails off into static. Kenneth's eyes are closed now. His wife and infant daughter sleep in the next room. The world has narrowed to breath, pulse, and dream. The air smells faintly of soap and motor oil, the scent that clings to his hands from years working in an auto parts factory. He doesn't know that in minutes, those same hands will write his name in blood. In the weeks before this night, Kenneth's life had begun to unravel. He had lost his job after a quiet scandal, missing funds from the company's safe, small amounts that became impossible to explain. His co-workers liked him. They spoke of him later as a kind kid, not a thief. But desperation is its own form of sleepwalking. Kenneth had been gambling at the racetrack for months, chasing the rush of one good win to make up for all the losses. The wins never came. By May, the savings were gone, the bills late, and shame lived behind every polite smile. He had told no one the full truth. Not his wife, not his in-laws, Barbara Ann and Dennis Woods, people he admired almost to fear. They were patient and practical, the kind of parents he wished he had grown up with. That evening, after a tense but loving dinner, he had promised his wife Karen that he would visit her parents the next day to explain everything. He wanted to beg forgiveness. He wanted to start over. In the quiet of the living room, those intentions folded into dream. Sleep takes him the way a tide takes a lost shoe, silently, completely. In deep, non-REM slumber, the body becomes its own machine, heart steady, muscles heavy, mind detached. Somewhere inside that silence, a current misfires, a line between rest and motion frays. His eyes open, though his consciousness does not. He rises. The sofa creaks, the floorboards groan, and Kenneth walks into the hallway with the eerie precision of routine. He picks up his car keys from the counter. The door clicks open. Cool night air washes over his face. A witness later remembered seeing a car pull from the curb at exactly 1:40 in the morning. The driver's movements calm, measured. The car turned east, heading toward Scarborough. He drives 22 kilometers through sleeping neighborhoods and empty stretches of highway. Traffic lights change from red to green over deserted intersections. The radio hums softly with static. He does not swerve, does not blink. The world outside is a tunnel of sodium orange light and rain-dark asphalt. He parks neatly outside the Woods house, the same place he had spent so many cheerful Sunday dinners. The spare key, always kept in the glove compartment, finds its way to his hand. The lock yields without sound. Inside, the house smells faintly of cinnamon and old paper. Photographs line the hallway, family portraits, holiday cards, a life preserved in glossy rectangles. Kenneth moves through the darkness as if following a script written in another language. His footsteps are quiet, steady. He opens the door to the master bedroom. What happens next? Even the doctors who later testified could only describe in fragments. The body can perform extraordinary acts while the mind sleeps. He finds a tire iron, maybe from the garage, maybe from the car, and a knife from the kitchen. His mother-in-law stirs. There is confusion, a sudden thud, a sharp rhythm of motion and breath. Dennis wakes to pain and chaos. Then, just as suddenly, silence. When Kenneth steps back into the hallway, the knife drops from his hand. His palms are cut, bleeding freely, yet he seems unaware. The moonlight catches the red sheen on his skin. For a moment he stands still, as if waiting for instruction, then turns and walks out the front door. The car engine starts again. He drives toward the police station. The distance is short. Street lights flash across his face. Blank, empty, like someone still half dreaming. The officers on duty will later say that when he walked in, barefoot, covered in blood, his voice was almost gentle. "I think I have killed 2 people," he said. "My hands hurt." The sergeant looked at him, unsure whether to reach for his gun or the first aid kit. Kenneth stood swaying, eyes unfocused, pulse strangely slow. When they asked what had happened, he could only repeat that line. "I think I have killed 2 people." By dawn, police cars lined the street outside the Woods house. Flashbulbs lit up the windows as detectives stepped through the doorway and into the smell of blood and silence. Barbara was dead. Dennis barely alive. Nothing was stolen. There were no signs of hatred, no words scrawled on walls, no notes of despair. Only a young man's fingerprints on the doorknob and a crimson trail leading back to a life that had come apart without anyone noticing. Later, in the ambulance, Kenneth began to tremble, though still he seemed to be waking from some deeper place. He asked where he was. The paramedic told him they were taking him to the hospital. He nodded slowly, as if hearing an echo from another world. When asked about the weapon, he told them exactly where it would be found. "In the kitchen," he murmured, "on the floor." The doctor who examined him noted something strange. Despite the deep lacerations on his hands, Kenneth reported almost no pain. His pulse remained low, his pupils reactive but calm. He looked less like a murderer and more like a man half drowned, surfacing through layers of sleep and guilt. As the first reporters began to arrive at the station, word spread that a young father had confessed to a killing he could not remember. By midday, the headlines called it the Sleepwalking murder. The phrase stuck: simple, absurd, terrifying. No one yet understood what had really happened that night, or how a man could walk through the boundary of sleep and emerge into violence. But in the days to come, as doctors, detectives, and lawyers circled around the mystery, they would all ask the same question: what if he truly never woke at all? Morning arrived like an accusation. The grey light through the hospital blinds fell across Kenneth's face, across the thin white sheets, and for a few seconds he believed he had simply overslept. The smell of antiseptic, the beep of monitors, the quiet shuffling of nurses, it all seemed ordinary, familiar, until he tried to move his hands. Pain roared up his arms like fire. His fingers were bandaged, thick and clumsy, and for a moment he couldn't remember why. The last thing he recalled was falling asleep on the couch, the hum of the television, the soft weight of exhaustion pressing him down. Then nothing, just the uneasy sense that something vast had gone wrong while he wasn't looking. A uniformed officer stood at the foot of his bed. "Kenneth," he said quietly, "do you know where you are?" The young man blinked. He said yes, but his voice carried uncertainty, as though he were reading the word from a stranger's script. The officer hesitated, then added, "Do you know what happened last night?" Kenneth shook his head. "No," he whispered. "Should I?" In the hours that followed, fragments of reality began to drift toward him like paper in the wind. Questions repeated, details rewritten, his own statements read back to him. "I think I killed 2 people. Each time the words were spoken aloud, he winced as if they belonged to someone else. When detectives explained that one of the victims was his mother-in-law, Barbara Ann, and that his father-in-law lay in critical condition, Kenneth stared in disbelief. He insisted he could never harm them, not even in anger. He asked whether this was a dream, whether they were certain it was real. No one answered. The human mind, they all realized, was a stage capable of impossible performances. Meanwhile, the newspapers had already decided what to call him. "The Sleepwalking Killer," screamed the morning editions, each word heavy as a gavel. Reporters camped outside the hospital, waiting for a glimpse of the young man whose story would soon divide both the public and the scientific community. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, the kind of boy who'd help you shovel snow. His co-workers spoke of stress, late nights, and a temper that was almost too calm. His wife Karen kept to herself, moving between the hospital where her father fought for his life and the small apartment where her baby slept, unaware that the world had collapsed around her. In the weeks that followed, the police tried to reconstruct the impossible. They examined tire tracks, timestamps, and blood patterns. Everything aligned with the confession Kenneth himself had delivered, yet none of it explained the absence of intent. He had driven with precision, obeyed traffic laws, used a spare key to enter the house, even remembered where the knife was left. These were not the actions of a man unconscious. And yet, every test, every interview, every physiological measurement hinted at something different, a mind that had gone dark while the body moved on its own. When sleep specialists at the Toronto Western Hospital heard of the case, they requested access to study him. At first, the detectives dismissed the idea as distraction, but the more they questioned him, the clearer it became that no ordinary explanation fit. Kenneth could recount his week in detail up until the moment he fell asleep. Beyond that, his memory dissolved into mist. He was not evasive. He was genuinely lost. Under controlled observation, doctors recorded his sleep patterns over several nights. Electrodes traced his brainwaves onto long strips of paper, peaks and valleys, mapping the borderlands between consciousness and oblivion. What they found startled them. During the deepest stages of non-rapid eye movement sleep, his brain showed sudden surges of motor activity, brief moments when muscle groups fired as though his body were preparing to stand, walk, even grasp objects. It was as if half his brain had awakened while the other half still dreamed. The findings matched what neurologists called somnambulistic automatism. In rare individuals, extreme stress, exhaustion, or chemical imbalance could trigger complex behavior while the conscious mind remained sealed away. Sleepwalkers had been known to cook meals, climb staircases, even leave their homes and return to bed without memory. But violence, murder, that was nearly unheard of. Doctors interviewed Kenneth's family, searching for childhood signs. His mother recalled that as a boy he sometimes wandered the house at night, eyes open, expression blank. Once she found him in the kitchen holding a glass of milk, asking softly for someone who wasn't there. Usually she guided him back to bed, and he never remembered. She had laughed about it then. It seemed harmless. As the medical reports accumulated, the prosecutors grew uneasy. They had a confession, a dead woman, a wounded man, but no motive that survived daylight. The evidence of financial stress was strong, but it explained little. Why would a man desperate to rebuild his life destroy it in one night? Why drive straight to the police instead of fleeing? The paradox deepened the longer they looked. Forensic psychologists began to attend the interviews, each with their own theory. Some believed that Kenneth's guilt and fear had combined to create a dissociative fugue, a waking dream in which suppressed rage took over. Others saw in him a textbook case of parasomnia triggered by exhaustion. One specialist noted that his deep sleep threshold was abnormally short. He could drop into the third stage of non-REM sleep in under 10 minutes. Combined with gambling stress, depression, and shame, it created the perfect storm. When they told Kenneth that Barbara had died and Dennis had survived, his body seemed to crumple. He pressed his bandaged hands against his face and wept, the sound thin and hollow. He asked to see his wife, but she refused. She could not bear to look at him. Somewhere inside her grief was confusion. If he truly hadn't meant it, who was she supposed to blame? Outside the hospital, the public argued loudly. Some called for mercy, others for punishment. Talk radio hosts debated whether the sleepwalking defense should exist at all. To many, it sounded like the perfect loophole. Commit a crime, claim unconsciousness, walk free. To others, it raised deeper, older fears that our bodies might betray us, that reason itself could vanish while our hearts kept beating. In the courtroom sketches printed weeks later, Kenneth always looked half-lit, a man caught between two worlds. His bandaged hands folded neatly in front of him, his face drawn but calm. Journalists described him as polite, even grateful when guards opened doors for him. He addressed everyone as sir or ma'am. One reporter wrote that his politeness made the crime feel even stranger, as though he had been possessed by sleep itself. As spring turned to summer, the question hardened into law. If a man kills without awareness, is he guilty at all? The prosecution prepared to argue that sleepwalking was just another name for pretense, a mask for guilt. The defense assembled neurologists, sleep experts, and psychologists ready to testify that Kenneth's body had simply done what the conscious brain could not stop. Between these two worlds, science and justice, stood a young man who truly did not know whether he was awake or dreaming. And as the days crept toward trial, Kenneth began to keep a small notebook. He filled it with fragments of memory, dreams of driving through rain, of a woman calling his name from far away. None of it made sense, but he wrote it down anyway, afraid that forgetting would make him disappear entirely. The notebook would later be found on his nightstand, open to a single unfinished line: "I hope I never sleep again." The trial of Kenneth Parks opened on a humid morning in May 1988, nearly a year to the day after the killing. Outside the courthouse in downtown Toronto, reporters clustered like seagulls, microphones flashing under the cloudy light. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of polished wood, paper, and nervous sweat. The courtroom filled early, journalists, law students, ordinary citizens drawn by curiosity or disbelief. For many, this was not simply a murder trial, it was a test of the human mind itself. Could a man commit a violent act while asleep? Could sleep itself be used as a defense? Kenneth sat beside his lawyers in a navy blue suit that hung a little loose from months of poor appetite. His hands were unbandaged now, the scars pale and shiny across his palms. He looked older than his years, as if sleep had become a dangerous luxury. The first thing jurors noticed was his composure. He didn't fidget, didn't avoid their gaze. He listened carefully, nodding at the judge's instructions, whispering occasionally to his defense attorney. If anyone expected the wild eyes of a killer, they found instead the distant calm of a man still trying to wake. The prosecution began by constructing the version of Kenneth they wanted the jury to see: a man trapped by debt, humiliated by unemployment, who snapped under pressure. They detailed the stolen company funds, the gambling losses, the shame he faced. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Crown Attorney declared, "we are not here to determine whether Mr. Parks was tired or stressed. We are here because he chose to solve his problems with blood." His words cut through the stillness, leaving a faint echo under the courtroom dome. The defense countered quietly but firmly. They did not deny the violence. They didn't need to. Their case rested on one simple assertion: Kenneth's body committed the crime, but his mind was asleep. They would prove, through medical evidence and expert testimony, that his actions were automatic, driven by a disorder beyond his conscious control. It was not about sympathy, they said. It was about truth. The truth that sleep can fracture the brain in ways even science barely understands. Day after day, the court became a classroom. Neurologists and sleep researchers explained the mechanics of somnambulism. They spoke of slow-wave sleep, of neural pathways that trigger motor movement without awareness. They played EEG recordings, spiked lines on long sheets of graph paper that looked like mountain ranges of the subconscious. One doctor described how Kenneth, during sleep tests, had sat up suddenly, eyes open but blank, and tried to remove the sensors from his scalp without waking. When they spoke to him, he mumbled nonsense, then lay back down and resumed normal breathing. He was between worlds, the doctor said. Not awake, not dreaming, just operating. The prosecution pressed hard. They pointed to the careful actions that night: the driving, the parking, the entry with a key as evidence of consciousness. "These are not random movements," one lawyer argued. "These are deliberate, coordinated decisions." He suggested Kenneth fabricated the sleepwalking story after realizing how hopeless his situation was. The courtroom buzzed. Kenneth's attorney responded by reminding the jury that people on autopilot could perform complex tasks while deeply asleep. "We all know stories," he said, "of sleepwalkers cooking meals, climbing ladders, even walking miles from home. Why not driving? Why not violence, if the emotional circuits misfire?" As the testimony unfolded, the human side of Kenneth's life seeped into view. His wife Karen appeared briefly, pale and composed, her voice shaking as she told the court about their life before the tragedy. She described him as loving, devoted to their baby daughter, frightened by his own losses but determined to rebuild. When asked whether she believed he could do such a thing consciously, she hesitated, then whispered, "No, but I also don't understand what happened to him." Her words hung in the air like a fragile truce between grief and disbelief. Outside the courthouse, the media devoured every detail. Canada's strangest murder defense screamed the headlines. Television anchors spoke of the killer who slept through the crime. Some experts called it groundbreaking, others dangerous. If Kenneth walked free, they warned, anyone could claim unconsciousness and escape justice. Yet the public fascination only deepened. Letters poured into the newspaper, some offering sympathy, others demanding his imprisonment. The case became a mirror reflecting the public's uneasy relationship with its own hidden mind. Inside the courtroom, sleep itself became the defendant. Jurors watched film footage of patients wandering hospital corridors in their nightclothes, eyes open, brains half asleep. They saw how stress, exhaustion, and trauma could tear open the seam between conscious and automatic. A psychiatrist compared it to a pilot light in a furnace. Even when the main switch is off, a spark remains capable of ignition. "Kenneth Parks," he said, "was that spark on the wrong night." The most haunting moment came when the defense played the recording of Kenneth's initial statement at the police station. His voice, captured on a scratchy tape, was slow, soft, almost childlike. "I think I killed 2 people, he said. "My hands hurt." The room fell silent. Even the journalists stopped writing. He sounded bewildered, not remorseful, like someone describing a dream they could barely grasp. When the tape clicked off, several jurors looked down at their laps, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Then came the testimony of Barbara Ann's surviving husband, Dennis Woods. His head still bore scars from the attack. He spoke gently, with the strange dignity of a man trying to understand the incomprehensible. "I do not hate him," he told the court. "He was like a son to me. If he says he didn't know what he was doing, maybe he didn't. I don't know." The words struck harder than any argument could, compassion mixed with sorrow, until no one in the room could separate one from the other. By the second week, exhaustion set in. The trial stretched late into evenings, the jurors' faces drawn and pale. Kenneth's lawyers emphasized the consistency of medical opinion, the honesty of his confession, the lack of motive. The prosecution countered with passion. "Sleepwalking is not an excuse for murder," they insisted. "We cannot let science write away responsibility." The judge listened, silent, his fingers steepled under his chin. In the gallery, a woman yawned quietly, her head drooping, her mind sliding toward the very state being debated. Late one afternoon, as rain lashed against the courthouse windows, Kenneth's attorney closed his argument. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "every one of us sleeps, every one of us dreams, and every one of us has felt that moment when we wake unsure where we are. Imagine that feeling stretched across an entire night. Imagine opening your eyes to find that sleep has betrayed you, that your own hands have done something your mind never intended. That is the terror my client lives with." His voice wavered, but he didn't falter. "He will live with it for the rest of his life, whether you convict him or not." The jury retired in silence. Outside, the sky cleared, a thin blade of sunlight cutting through the clouds. Inside, Kenneth sat with his head bowed, listening to the echo of footsteps fade behind the courtroom door. He felt neither hope nor despair, only a hollow stillness, as if the trial were happening to someone else. Maybe in a way it was. The jury deliberated for nearly 10 hours, sealed inside a wood-panelled room where the air smelled of coffee and rain-soaked coats. Outside, television vans idled along University Avenue, antennas reaching into the cloudy sky, reporters paced, lighting cigarettes, rehearsing live stand-ups for whichever verdict emerged. Inside the courthouse, Kenneth sat alone at the defense table, hands folded, head bowed, eyes unfocused. The bailiff moved quietly between benches. The clock ticked without mercy. No one spoke. By evening, the jurors filed back into the courtroom, faces pale and unreadable. Cameras waited like vultures in the hall. When the foreman handed the slip of paper to the clerk, time seemed to stretch thin as glass. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and read aloud. On the charge of murder in the first degree, not guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, not guilty. The words hung in the air, unbelievable, echoing off the walls before anyone reacted. Kenneth didn't move at first. He blinked once, then twice, as though trying to translate what he'd heard. His attorney touched his arm. "You're free, Kenneth," he whispered. Only then did the young man exhale, a trembling breath that seemed to deflate a year's worth of fear. Across the aisle, reporters burst from the benches, rushing toward the doors. The judge's gavel struck hard against the wood. "Order," he barked, but no one listened. The sleepwalking killer had been acquitted. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. The sky had turned violet grey, wet and heavy. Cameras flashed as Kenneth stepped into the rain, flanked by his lawyers. His wife wasn't there. Neither were her parents' friends, or the neighbors who once waved to him across their lawns. The courthouse plaza was a maze of microphones and questions. "Do you feel remorse?" shouted one reporter. "Do you think justice was done?" asked another. Kenneth said nothing. He looked dazed, like a man just waking from a nightmare he couldn't fully remember. The acquittal ignited a storm that spread far beyond Ontario. Television panels debated whether the law had lost its mind. Some hailed the decision as proof that science could illuminate justice. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent, a loophole for future killers. Headlines from London to Los Angeles carried the same haunting phrase, "the man who killed in his sleep." In the quiet corners of psychology departments and law schools, professors turned the case into lectures, footnotes, cautionary tales. For Kenneth, freedom was its own kind of sentence. The first night after the verdict, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of a small rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, watching headlights smear across wet pavement. Every time he closed his eyes, flashes returned, a hallway, the gleam of metal, the echo of footsteps that might have been his own. He told his lawyer he felt as if his life belonged to someone else now. "When people see me," he said, "they see the story, not the person." He tried to rebuild. He took a job at a local community center, repairing gym equipment, stacking supplies, avoiding small talk. His wife Karen met him for lunch once, weeks after the verdict. They sat in a booth at a diner off the highway, the kind with vinyl seats and sugar dispensers that stick. Their conversation was quiet, polite, almost formal. She said she was trying to move on. He nodded. "I understand," he murmured, though understanding was far from what he felt. When she left, she paused at the door, as if about to turn back, but didn't. The bell above the frame jingled, and she was gone. Public reaction oscillated between sympathy and fear. Strangers sent letters, some thanking him for surviving, others damning him as a liar who'd fooled the system. One envelope contained a newspaper clipping with a single line scrawled across it in red pen, "You can't sleep forever." He burned that one in the sink, but the words lingered. The Woods family, devastated yet restrained, made no public statement. Dennis recovered slowly, his injuries leaving him with partial vision loss and tremors in one hand. He retreated from public life, selling the family home where the attack had occurred. The new owners repainted the walls, replaced the carpets, planted roses along the fence, but the house never lost its silence. Neighbors swore they sometimes saw lights flicker in the windows late at night, though the rooms were empty. Kenneth's case reshaped Canadian law. Legal scholars coined terms like non-insane automatism, a classification that separated his condition from mental illness. The Supreme Court would later cite the ruling in similar cases, each time invoking the same uneasy question: when the body commits a crime without the mind, where does responsibility lie? In time, the precedent spread to other countries. Defendants in Britain, Australia, and the United States invoked the Parks defense, though few succeeded. Most juries still believed intent lived somewhere, however deep. Years passed. Kenneth remained mostly invisible, surfacing only for medical evaluations and a handful of interviews. His hair turned grey early. His voice grew quieter, measured. When asked if he ever slept peacefully again, he smiled faintly and said, "I sleep lightly." He remarried once, divorced quietly, moved west, found work in social services helping people with addiction and stress, perhaps to atone for what his own stress had done. He spoke rarely of the night that changed everything, though when he did, his tone carried neither denial nor certainty. "It's a hole," he said once. "You learn to live around it." In the years that followed, science evolved around him. Sleep clinics multiplied, brain imaging improved, and what had once seemed impossible became marginally less so. Researchers mapped the circuitry that allowed complex behaviors during partial arousal states, finding patterns eerily consistent with his case. Still, the mystery refused to close. Some insisted that subconscious rage had guided his hand, that the mind had created its own alibi. Others saw him as a living example of how fragile human consciousness truly is. On cold nights, he drove past the neighborhood where the Woods once lived. The street was ordinary. Children's bikes in driveways, porch lights glowing, but each shadow seemed to hold the echo of that forgotten night. Sometimes he parked across from the house, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel, just watching. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe forgiveness, maybe proof that it had really happened. Then, when the weight grew too heavy, he'd drive home and sit awake until dawn, listening to the tick of the kitchen clock, afraid to close his eyes. The case faded from headlines, then from memory, but in law journals and sleep laboratories his name endured like a caution whispered between disciplines. The line between waking and dreaming remained where it always had been, thin, uncertain, and impossible to see until it tore. Years after the verdict, the story of Kenneth Parks became legend, retold in documentaries, crime anthologies, even classroom lectures where students whispered to each other that he was the man who killed while dreaming. But away from television screens and lecture halls, Kenneth's life moved in small, quiet circles. He rented a modest house near Hamilton, Ontario, with peeling paint and a lawn that never seemed to grow straight. He worked part-time at a warehouse, clocking in early, leaving late, keeping to himself. To most of his co-workers he was simply Ken, polite, forgettable, never raising his voice. None of them knew that he once stood at the center of one of the strangest criminal trials in modern history. In public he smiled when approached, signed documents, paid bills. In private he kept a strict ritual: bed by 10, no caffeine, no alcohol, a small lamp left burning in the corner of the room. The doctors had warned him that stress and exhaustion could trigger the same sleepwalking state again, so he treated rest like a fragile machine, something that might break if handled roughly. He learned breathing exercises, kept a diary of every dream he could remember. Most were harmless: walking through fog, hearing distant laughter, driving endlessly without destination. But sometimes he dreamed of red light flashing across wet floors, and he would wake with the taste of metal in his mouth and tears on his face. His therapist, a middle-aged neurologist named Dr. Selma Rayner, once asked him if he believed he was innocent. Kenneth hesitated for a long time before answering. "Legally, yes," he said, "but not morally. The law says I didn't mean to do it. My heart says I should have stopped myself somehow." Dr. Rayner wrote that down and underlined it twice. She told him guilt was not proof of awareness. It was proof of conscience. But conscience, Kenneth thought, was the one thing sleep had left untouched, and that made it worse. Outside his own story, the scientific community continued to unravel the phenomenon he embodied. Across North America, neurologists and psychologists began publishing studies on automatism, the state in which the brain executes complex actions while consciousness remains dormant. They called it paradoxical arousal, a phrase that sounded clinical but described something almost supernatural. In the late 80s and early 90s, researchers used Kenneth's case as their cornerstone, citing his name in peer-reviewed journals, noting how his EEG patterns and physiological responses matched the deepest stages of non-rapid eye movement sleep. To them, he was both man and evidence, a walking experiment. The press, however, treated him differently. They hunted him for anniversaries, 5 years, 10 years, 15, each time offering money for interviews he never gave. Once a reporter left a note taped to his mailbox. "If you don't tell your story, someone else will." He read it, tore it in half and burned it in an ashtray. But the stories still came, written by others, each one twisting the facts a little further until even he could no longer tell where truth ended and folklore began. In some versions he was a monster, in others, a tragic dreamer. Neither felt real. It wasn't until the mid-90s that Kenneth agreed to appear, anonymously, in a medical documentary about sleep disorders. His face was shadowed, his voice altered, but the cadence of his speech gave him away to anyone who had ever seen the old footage. The interviewer asked him what he thought about sleep now after everything. He paused before answering. "Sleep used to be a place I went to rest," he said. "Now it's a place I visit carefully, like a cliff edge. You learn not to look down." Meanwhile, the house in Scarborough, the scene of that night, changed owners twice more. The new families painted the walls a soft yellow, tore out the old carpet, replaced the locks. But the neighborhood never quite forgot. Children dared each other to touch the front gate after dark. Teenagers whispered that if you stood there at 2 in the morning, you could hear the sound of an engine idling, just once before fading away. The truth was quieter but no less haunting. The mind's capacity to rewrite terror into myth was endless. Kenneth's health began to falter as he entered his 40s. Years of insomnia and anxiety carved shadows under his eyes. He developed ulcers from coffee and stress. On bad nights, he called Dr. Rayner's voicemail just to hear the familiar tone of her machine. Once, during a session, he asked whether she believed people could be two things at once, good and terrible, conscious and lost. She smiled sadly. "That's what being human is," she said. "You just experienced it more dramatically than most." By then, advances in brain imaging had produced a clearer picture of sleepwalking. Researchers at McGill University and in Zurich conducted experiments showing that parts of the brain controlling movement and habit could activate, while the regions responsible for reasoning remained offline. One neurologist referred to it as a biological ghost, a mechanism evolved for survival that sometimes misfires under pressure. They studied trauma survivors, veterans, and overworked professionals, all showing similar neurological signatures when deprived of rest. Kenneth's name appeared again and again in their citations, a reminder of the night when theory became blood. He followed these studies closely, cutting out newspaper clippings and saving them in a folder labeled research. Occasionally he wrote letters to the scientists, thanking them for continuing to look for the truth. Most never replied. To them he was a footnote. To himself he was living evidence that the mind could turn against its host. One evening, while driving home from work, he stopped at a red light and caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The streetlight framed his face in the same amber glow he remembered from that long-ago night. His eyes looked older, yes, but there was still a trace of the same uncertainty, a man not sure whether he was awake. He gripped the steering wheel tightly until the light changed, then drove on, whispering to himself, "Stay here, stay awake." At home, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. He poured a glass of water, set it beside the bed, and checked the locks twice. Then he sat for a long time on the edge of the mattress, staring at his hands, the same hands that once belonged to a stranger. The scars had faded, but the memory hadn't. He lay down carefully, pulling the blanket to his chest. "Just sleep," he murmured. "Just sleep." The lamp stayed on. That night he dreamed he was driving again, the road stretching endlessly ahead, the sky dark but calm. In the passenger seat sat his mother-in-law, alive and smiling, as though they were on their way to breakfast. She turned to him and said, "You can stop now, Kenny. You're home." He woke before he could answer, heart hammering, dawn light filtering through the blinds. The digital clock read 6:15. Another day survived. Another night, unremembered. He rose, made coffee, and watched the steam drift toward the ceiling. Outside, the city yawned awake. Inside, he stood motionless, listening to the faint tick of the kitchen clock, the sound that tethered him to reality, 1 second at a time. Time has a strange way of stretching and folding around guilt. For Kenneth, the years after the verdict passed both too quickly and not at all. His world became narrow, a predictable rhythm of work, therapy, and the soft, deliberate rituals he used to anchor himself in wakefulness. He measured safety not in hours of sleep, but in how vividly he could remember them. If the morning began with memory intact, it meant another night had passed without betrayal. The outside world, however, refused to forget. Every few years, a documentary or true crime series revived the story, attaching dramatic subtitles like The Sleepwalking Killer or Murder in a Dream. Actors played him as a haunted figure, blank-eyed, pale, a puppet of his subconscious. Directors loved the symmetry of it, innocence and horror sharing one body. Each retelling brought reporters back to his doorstep. Sometimes they left notes, sometimes cameras. Once a production crew even set up across the street, filming long shots of his front window. He drew the curtains and didn't open them for 3 days. He tried to live a life that wasn't constantly shadowed by that night, but it was like trying to breathe underwater. He attended sleep clinic seminars, volunteered to participate in research studies, even traveled once to Montreal for an experimental therapy program, combining neurofeedback with guided meditation. The doctors called it reintegrative sleep therapy, a method designed to teach the brain to recognize when it's slipping toward the border between consciousness and automatism. They wired his scalp with sensors and played soft tones whenever his brain waves began to resemble those of the night he walked. The theory was that over time, the subconscious would learn to wake itself. The process was tedious, frustrating, and at times surreal. Hours spent in a dimly lit room, the quiet beeping of machines keeping rhythm with his breath. Sometimes he thought he could feel the old patterns returning, the slow tidal pull of deep sleep trying to reclaim him, but he pushed back, focusing on the tone, the low hum that meant awareness. After each session, he walked outside into the Montreal dusk, the sky pink with smog, and felt the strange gratitude of a man who feared his own dreams. Despite therapy, nightmares remained. They came less often but with greater precision. The sensation of motion, the weight of something unseen in his hands, the sound of running water. Once he dreamed of standing in an empty courtroom. No judge, no jury, just the echo of his footsteps. On the witness stand sat himself, younger, bandaged, staring at him without expression. "Who are you?" Kenneth asked. The other him smiled faintly. "You're still asleep." He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the echo of those words clinging like frost. Dr. Rayner encouraged him to write again, not about the trial but about his life beyond it. So he filled notebooks with quiet observations, the smell of rain on asphalt, the sound of freight trains passing at night, the comfort of routine. He wrote about his daughter, now grown, studying psychology in university. She rarely spoke of her mother's family, but sometimes she called him late at night, her voice soft and uncertain. "Dad, how did you live with it?" she asked once. He told her the truth. "You learn to keep waking up," was Tway. In the spring of 2003, An invitation arrived from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. They were hosting a symposium on sleep-related violence and asked him to participate in a panel about ethics and culpability. At first, he declined, but curiosity gnawed at him. He wanted to know how his name lived on in the mouths of others, whether he was still a monster or something more ambiguous. After several sleepless nights, he accepted. The auditorium was smaller than he expected, filled with academics, students, and a few journalists. He sat at the far end of the table, beside a neurologist from Switzerland and a criminal law professor. When it was his turn to speak, he leaned toward the microphone, hands trembling. "I used to think sleep was a place we went to escape," he began. "But it isn't. It's another version of the world, one where the rules are looser, where the body remembers things the mind has forgotten." The room was silent. He continued, slowly. "When people ask me if I'm guilty, I tell them yes. Not because I meant to hurt anyone, but because I was the door it came through. Whatever happened that night, stress, exhaustion, or something broken in the brain, it came through me." He paused, searching for words that could hold such contradiction. "I have spent the rest of my life trying to make sure that door stays closed." Afterward, several students approached him. Some were trembling. Others looked at him with a kind of reverence. One young woman thanked him for his honesty, saying she had a brother who sleepwalked and that her family lived in fear of what might happen one day. Kenneth smiled gently. "Most of us walk in our sleep in one way or another," he said. "We just don't always leave the house." Later, walking back to his hotel, he felt lighter than he had in years. The city's hum surrounded him, cars passing, faint laughter spilling from a bar, the scent of wet pavement. For the first time, he thought maybe he was part of the world again. But when he returned to his room, sleep refused to come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muted rush of traffic below. Just before dawn, he drifted off, not into rest, but into a strange half-dream. He was driving again. The dashboard lights glowed blue. Outside the windshield, fog coiled across the road. He could see only a few meters ahead, but he kept moving, guided by instinct. In the passenger seat sat no one this time. The silence was almost comforting. Then, from somewhere in the dark, came the faint chime of a bell, a sound from the lab, from the therapy sessions. It grew louder, insistent. He realized dimly that it was meant to wake him. He pressed his foot to the brake, but the car didn't slow. The fog thickened until the road disappeared. He tried to speak, but the dream held him fast. Then, with a jolt, he woke. The room was still. The clock on the nightstand read 4:27. His heart raced, but his hands were steady. He swung his legs over the bed, stood, and walked to the window. The first light of morning painted the city silver. He whispered to the reflection in the glass, "You're awake. Stay awake." Then he smiled, just slightly, and turned away. For the first time in decades, he slept again the following night, uninterrupted. The world, at least for now, stayed intact. The years that followed gave Kenneth something resembling peace. Though peace for him was never silence, it was a careful balance between control and surrender. He lived quietly in a small apartment above a hardware store, the kind of place where the smell of sawdust and paint lingered in the hallways. The owner, an old man named Ralph, liked him because he paid on time and never made noise. Sometimes Kenneth helped customers carry boxes up the stairs or fixed broken locks. He had learned to keep his hands busy. Stillness, he'd discovered, was when the past spoke loudest. By then, his daughter had graduated and begun working as a counselor for trauma survivors. She called often, gently but persistently, encouraging him to travel, to see the world beyond Ontario. At first he resisted. Travel meant hotels, unfamiliar beds, the unpredictable weight of new nights. But she kept asking, and one spring he agreed to visit Vancouver, where she'd moved. The flight was calm, and for the first time in years he fell asleep without medication. When he woke, the plane was descending through clouds so thick they glowed like milk. For a moment he thought he was dreaming again, but then the wheels touched down and the vibration grounded him in the present. Vancouver felt alive in a way Toronto never had. Mountains on the horizon, sea air sharp with salt, the constant murmur of rain. His daughter met him at the airport, hugging him like someone determined to pull him out of history. They spent the week walking along the waterfront, sharing quiet meals, talking about everything except the thing that bound them. She showed him her office, her favorite cafe, her small apartment filled with plants. One evening, as the sky bruised purple over the harbor, she asked if he still dreamed of the night that changed everything. He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Not of that night," he said, "but sometimes I dream that I wake up and it's happening again, that I'm watching myself, and I can't stop it." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You always wake up," she said. "That's what matters." It was during that trip that he met a researcher named Dr. Mark Kells, a sleep neurologist from the University of British Columbia, who had built his career studying parasomnia triggered by stress. Kells recognized him immediately. Kenneth's case had been one of the reasons he'd gone into the field. He approached politely, introducing himself at a public lecture on the ethics of criminal sleep disorders. Kenneth laughed softly when he realized the irony of it all. The two men talked for hours afterward, walking along the seawall while the city lights shimmered across the water. Kells asked if Kenneth would be willing to participate in a long-term study, a new imaging technique that could, in theory, capture the moment the brain slipped from consciousness into automatism. Kenneth agreed, though not out of curiosity. He said he wanted to leave something behind that might help prevent another case like his own. Over the next 2 years, he visited Vancouver several times, each trip blending science with quiet therapy. Electrodes traced the geography of his sleep, while scanners painted the architecture of his brain in radiant colors. The images revealed subtle scars in the thalamus and prefrontal cortex, tiny disruptions in the circuits that linked intention with motion. "You've been carrying this a long time," Kells said once, looking at the screen. Kenneth smiled faintly. "I know." The study attracted international attention. Newspapers revived his name again, though now they spoke of him not as a killer but as a patient, a man who had become the key to understanding one of the mind's strangest disorders. He handled the interviews carefully, his voice measured, his eyes steady. "If what happened to me can help others, then maybe it wasn't entirely meaningless," he said during one broadcast. Viewers noted how calm he sounded, almost serene. But when the cameras turned off, he sat in the empty studio for a long time, staring at his hands in the harsh light, waiting for them to feel like his again. Not all attention was kind. Anonymous letters still found their way into his mailbox. Some accused him of faking everything, others of escaping justice. He never replied. Dr. Kells told him not to read them, but Kenneth always did, not out of masochism but out of ritual. Each letter reminded him that his story no longer belonged to him alone. It was a mirror for the world's unease with itself, the fear that consciousness could flicker like a faulty bulb, that morality could vanish for a moment and never return. During one of the study sessions, a young intern asked him if he remembered anything from the night in question, not the facts, but sensations. Kenneth thought for a long time before answering. "I remember movement," he said quietly, "and cold, like air on my skin, and then a noise, like a door closing. After that, nothing, just the feeling that something was waiting for me to wake up." The intern said nothing, only nodded, perhaps realizing she was hearing the closest thing to a description of unconscious violence anyone had ever given. In the following months, Kenneth became close friends with Dr. Kells. They often met outside the lab, sharing coffee, walking along the shore in the rain. Kells once confessed that what fascinated him most was not the crime but Kenneth's endurance. "Most people would have broken," he said. Kenneth shrugged. "Maybe I did. I just never stopped trying to fix the pieces." The doctor smiled, understanding that survival sometimes looks a lot like repair. As the study concluded, Kells invited Kenneth to speak at a medical conference in Geneva, a symbolic full circle, given that his strange journey had once begun in Canada, but echoed through Europe's legal systems. Kenneth hesitated. Air travel still unnerved him, but something inside him wanted to face it. "Maybe it's time," he said. "Maybe I need to see what all of this has become." He accepted, though he told no one except his daughter. The conference took place in the autumn of 2007. The hall was bright, sterile, filled with scientists, ethicists, and lawyers. When Kenneth walked on stage, the crowd rose in quiet respect. He looked out over a sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, all human. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he began. "I'm here to remind you how fragile the mind can be. You study it every day, you map it, measure it, scan it, but you still sleep, you still dream. Remember that you are only one heartbeat away from the edge." When he finished, the applause was soft but lasting. That night, back in his hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, he stood by the window watching the lights of the city ripple across the water. The air was cool, the hum of traffic distant. For the first time in decades, he felt no fear of the coming night. He turned off the lamp, lay down, and closed his eyes. In the darkness he whispered, "Let me rest." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. He awoke the next morning to the soft sound of church bells drifting across Lake Geneva. For a moment, Kenneth couldn't tell if he was still dreaming. The air held that blue-grey stillness that happens before sunrise, when even the city seems to breathe in unison. He sat up slowly, half expecting the familiar fog of anxiety to descend, but it didn't. His hands were steady, his pulse slow. The conference had ended the night before, but its echoes lingered, conversations about the boundaries of consciousness, the way one life could become the case study for an entire science. He felt hollowed out but lighter somehow, as if a long exhalation had finally finished after 20 years. He spent that morning walking along the cobblestone streets, stopping at a cafe for coffee and a pastry. The waiter didn't recognize him, and the anonymity felt like grace. He watched people hurry past, their lives intact, their dreams still private, and realized how rarely he had been part of that simple rhythm. When he returned to the hotel to pack, he paused at the mirror above the dresser. The man who looked back at him had silver hair now and faint lines around his eyes. He didn't look like the young man from the police photographs or the one trembling in the courtroom. He looked like someone who had survived both of them. Back in Canada, his days grew gentler. He moved to a smaller town near Lake Ontario, trading the noise of the city for the hush of water and wind. The house he chose overlooked a field of tall grass that turned gold every autumn. There were no reporters there, no curious neighbors, just space and quiet. He found work helping patients at a rehabilitation center, teaching them how to rebuild coordination after strokes or accidents. "I know a little about starting over," he'd tell them, and they'd smile, unaware of how much truth was folded into that sentence. The staff liked him, called him Mr. Parks or simply Ken. He organized group walks, read aloud to the visually impaired, fixed broken wheelchairs in his spare time. When his colleagues later learned who he was, inevitably through an old article, they treated him differently at first, cautious, watchful, but Kenneth disarmed them with humility. "Yes," he'd say when asked quietly, "I'm that Kenneth, but that was a long time ago. These days I mostly fix things." Slowly the tension dissolved, replaced by a quiet respect. Sleep remained a careful negotiation. Most nights he managed 5 or 6 hours, occasionally 7. He still left a lamp burning low, though he no longer checked the locks 3 times. When dreams came, they were softer, walking through empty fields, waves breaking in slow motion, faces he couldn't quite name smiling at him from a distance. He woke each morning to the sound of birds in the trees and the smell of rain-soaked earth. He had begun to believe that peace might not mean forgetting. It might mean living beside the memory, without letting it speak louder than the present. Every so often, Dr. Kells called from Vancouver to check on him. Their friendship had evolved into something quiet and brotherly. Once, Kells told him, "You've changed how we understand sleep. Do you realize that?" Kenneth laughed. "I didn't mean to," he said. "I just wanted to close my eyes without fear." Kells replied, "Sometimes that's where real science begins, with someone afraid of the dark." The media still resurfaced his name from time to time, especially when new cases emerged, rare but dramatic, where sleepwalking collided with violence. Reporters recycled old footage, the scarred hands, the courtroom sketches, the solemn face behind glass. But Kenneth no longer felt anger when he saw them. He'd learned that history doesn't belong to the people who live it. It belongs to the people who need it to mean something. His story had become an allegory about fear, responsibility, and the unknowable machinery inside the human brain. He could live with that. One evening in late autumn, he received a letter from a woman in Sweden. She was a doctor who treated patients with sleep disorders, and she wrote to thank him. "Your case," she said, "taught the world to treat sleepwalking as a condition, not a myth. Because of you, people are safer." It was the first letter in decades that didn't accuse or pity him. He read it several times, then placed it in the folder labeled Research, right next to the yellowing news clippings from his trial. As winter settled in, the lake froze along the edges and mist hung low in the mornings. He spent his free time reading, tending to a small garden of potted herbs, and writing letters he never sent. Sometimes he thought about Barbara Ann and Dennis, about the life that ended and the one that nearly did. He visited their graves once, quietly leaving a single white flower between the two stones. He stood there for a long time, the cold biting through his coat until the world blurred with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wish I could have been awake for you." On the drive back, the snow began to fall in slow spirals, coating the windshield in silver dust. He turned on the wipers and watched the world appear and disappear, appear and disappear. It reminded him of sleep, the way awareness flickered between darkness and light. For the first time, he didn't feel afraid of it. When he reached home, he made tea and sat by the window, listening to the muffled quiet of snowfall. Outside, the street lamps glowed like paper lanterns. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called once and then fell silent. Kenneth smiled faintly, breathing in the scent of steam and mint. "You're safe," he told himself. "You're here." He went to bed early that night. The window cracked open just enough to let in the cold. As he drifted towards sleep, he felt the edge of consciousness blur, the familiar threshold, but gentler now, forgiving. He whispered the same phrase he had told himself every night for 20 years, "Stay here, stay awake." But this time he said it not as a warning, but as a wish. And for the first time it felt like the world listened. By the time Kenneth reached his 60s, the years had softened into something almost tender. He had grown into the quiet rhythms of solitude. The kettle's sigh in the morning, the scrape of chair legs on old wood, the whistle of the lake wind against his window panes. He no longer feared his own reflection. His hair was silver now, his posture stooped, but his eyes, those weary, pale blue eyes, still carried that faint, searching clarity of a man who has spent most of his life watching his mind from the outside. He kept to small routines. Mornings were for reading, afternoons for walking the lake shore. The evenings were his sanctuary, tea steaming beside a lamp, journal open, words scrawled carefully in block letters. His handwriting had become slower over the years, but deliberate, as if the act of forming each word tethered him to the present. He wrote about the seasons, about the sound of water against stone, about the strange peace that comes from survival. The notebooks filled shelves in his living room, each labeled by year, each one a map of wakefulness. Every now and then, a journalist or graduate student still reached out, eager to interview the man who slept through murder. Most he ignored. A few he answered, gently but briefly, telling them that memory was not an archive but a wound, and that some stories were better left to fade. Yet he remained generous with scientists who asked. They were trying to understand, not to exploit. He spoke at a few conferences quietly, his voice low, almost hypnotic, as he described the way the brain can fracture under the weight of exhaustion. He never sensationalized. "You don't need horror to make people listen," he'd say. "Truth already has enough gravity." In those years, the study of parasomnia grew into a discipline of its own. Sleep laboratories multiplied. Documentaries re-examined old cases with new technology. They mapped the strange architecture of non-REM sleep, tracing the loops and circuits that guided the unconscious through its secret choreography. Kenneth's case remained the anchor, the oldest, most haunting example of the mind losing itself mid-dream. His name appeared in textbooks beside diagrams of brain waves, nestled between Latin terms and citations, his tragedy reduced to a paragraph. He didn't mind. To him, that paragraph meant that something good had been built atop his wreckage. In the winter of 2013, his daughter visited with her own little boy, a 6-year-old with wild hair and endless questions. Kenneth adored him instantly. They fed ducks by the frozen lake and built lopsided snowmen in the yard. When the boy asked about the faint white lines on his grandfather's hands, Kenneth smiled and said, "Those are old stories." The child nodded solemnly, accepting the answer. That evening, as they watched snow drift past the window, his daughter leaned close and whispered, "You did it, Dad. You turned it into something else." He nodded, though his throat tightened. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe time just sanded the edges." That night, after they left, he sat by the window long after midnight. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint hum of wind. He looked out across the frozen lake, the moonlight turning the surface to silver glass, and for the first time in decades, he felt something almost like closure. He understood now that forgiveness wasn't a door someone else had to open. It was the act of standing outside forever and realizing you no longer needed to go in. He thought of Barbara and Dennis, of the life that had been shattered like glass beneath the hammer of that terrible night. He knew his freedom would never balance the scale, but perhaps the years he'd spent helping others, the sleepless nights spent guarding the fragile piece of his mind, had tipped it a little closer to even. Sometimes when the wind rose, he imagined her voice in it, not accusing, not forgiving, just present, the way sound lingers in a room long after the speaker is gone. In early spring, he received a letter from Dr. Kells, now older himself and soon retiring. It was short, written in a shaky hand. "We've learned so much since you came to us," it read, "but every time we trace a new pathway in the brain, it leads back to the mystery of what you lived through. Thank you for helping us see that the mind's darkness is still human." Kenneth placed the letter in his journal and closed it gently, feeling a quiet pride he hadn't allowed himself in years. Later that week, he returned to the community center, where he still volunteered part-time. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and floor polish. He helped an elderly man practice walking across a balance rail, his hand steady on the small of the man's back. "Take it slow," Kenneth murmured, "one step at a time." When the man reached the end, he turned and smiled. "You make it look easy," he said. Kenneth smiled back, but something inside him stirred. A familiar recognition. He realized that these small acts, the hands guiding, the calm voice encouraging movement, were the inverse of that night decades ago. This was how you undo violence, one quiet kindness at a time. That evening, a soft rain began to fall. He left the center and walked home without an umbrella, letting the water soak through his jacket. The streets shimmered beneath the lamps, each puddle reflecting a fragment of the sky. Passing cars hissed by, their headlights streaking across the wet asphalt. He thought of all the nights he had once feared this hour, the border between wakefulness and sleep, and how it had finally become gentle again. He stopped once, staring at his reflection in a puddle, distorted but whole. "Still here," he whispered, and kept walking. At home he made tea, the kettle's whistle filling the small kitchen. He drank it slowly, savoring the warmth, the simple taste of living. In his journal, he wrote a single sentence, "I am no longer afraid of dreaming." Then he closed the book, turned off the lamp, and watched the light fade across the room until only the moon remained. Outside, The rain thinned into mist. The lake, half frozen, sighed against the shore. And somewhere in that quiet rhythm, Kenneth finally found what he had been chasing all along. Not sleep, not forgiveness, but the delicate peace of knowing he had survived himself. In the final years of his life, Kenneth's world grew smaller again, though not from fear this time, from a deliberate gentleness. He had come to see that the mind, after decades of holding weight, deserves stillness. The house by the lake had become more than a refuge. It was an echo chamber for memory. The mornings began with light spilling over the water like slow fire, and each evening ended with him sitting by the same window, tea cooling in his hands, watching the horizon blur into darkness. Age had softened the sharper edges of his anxiety. He still slept with a lamp on, but only because he liked the amber glow. Sometimes he woke in the middle of the night and listened. For rain, for wind, for proof that the world still moved. He no longer feared sleepwalking. It had been more than 20 years since his last episode. The doctors told him he had healed, but he knew healed was too neat a word. Some things don't vanish. They just stop screaming. He spent his 70s as a mentor of sorts to others who'd endured strange disorders of consciousness. Men and women who had done things they could not explain. Some had walked away from car crashes they didn't remember. Some had found themselves miles from home with no idea how they'd gotten there. Kenneth wrote to them, listened to them, never offering advice, only empathy. "You will never find logic in it," he wrote once to a young man from Norway, "but you can still find yourself." Every autumn his daughter and grandson came to visit. The boy, now tall and curious, loved to fish at the edge of the lake. Kenneth taught him to bait hooks, to read the ripples, to wait in silence for the line to move. Fishing, he said, is just learning how to be patient with the water. He smiled each time the boy nodded, not yet realizing that his grandfather was really teaching him how to be patient with himself. In those years, the world had changed. Phones shrank to glass rectangles, news traveled faster than thought, and the story of the sleepwalking killer resurfaced every few years in some new form. Podcasts, documentaries, short films, each retelling treated him like an artifact of strangeness. But none of them saw the man he had become. He stopped caring. His daughter once asked if he resented how they still used his name. He shook his head. "The story needed a body," he said quietly. "I just happened to be there." He continued to write every day, though his handwriting had become shaky. His journals from this period were full of reflections on consciousness, guilt, and grace. One passage read, "What is sleep but the mind rehearsing death? What is waking but the refusal to stay gone?" He wrote those words without sadness. To him they were not philosophy but simple observation, the rhythm that had governed his entire life. In the spring of 2022, he was diagnosed with a heart condition. The doctors prescribed medication and rest, and he followed their orders with the same precision he'd once used to survive insomnia. He didn't fear dying. When he told his daughter, she cried quietly and asked if he wanted to move closer to her. He smiled and said no. "The lake knows me," he said. "It's as close to peace as I'll ever get." As summer waned, his strength faded, but his mind remained sharp. He could still recall the sound of rain against the police station windows, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, the moment the judge said not guilty, and the world tipped sideways. Those memories no longer felt like daggers. They were simply part of the landscape now, like scars on an old tree. On his final night, the air was cool and clear, a thin fog hanging over the lake. Kenneth made tea, added honey, and carried the cup to his favorite chair by the window. He watched the reflection of the moon trembling in the dark water. The wind whispered through the reeds, and the clock in the kitchen ticked, soft and patient. He thought of Barbara and Dennis, of Karen, of his daughter and grandson, of all the strangers who had studied his life and tried to decipher it. He thought of sleep, the borderland that had once betrayed him, and then slowly forgiven him. He closed his eyes, the cup still warm in his hands. His breathing slowed, evened out, then softened further. If there was fear, it never showed. His daughter found him the next morning, the tea untouched, the lamp still glowing faintly beside him. His expression was serene, his hands resting loosely on his lap, as though he had simply drifted from one room of the mind to another. At his funeral, a small crowd gathered. Family, a few neighbours, 2 doctors, and a scattering of former patients. The sky was overcast but gentle. His daughter read from one of his notebooks. "We are all sleepwalkers in our own way, walking through memories we can't change, hoping to wake before we hurt anyone we love." When she finished, there was silence, broken only by the rustle of wind through the birch trees. They buried him overlooking the water. The gravestone was simple. Kenneth James Parks, 1963, 2023. He woke, and kept waking. In the years that followed, people still spoke of him, not with fear, but with curiosity and quiet respect. His story became less about the crime and more about the fragile miracle of consciousness itself. Scientists cited him, writers evoked him, but those who had met him in person remembered something else entirely, a man who had learned to carry unimaginable guilt with grace. And sometimes, when fog rolls over the lake and the night is still, locals say the old lamp in his window flickers once, just as it used to when he couldn't sleep. They call it coincidence, or maybe just imagination, but those who knew the story understand. Some lights, once lit by darkness, never truly go out. And so the story of Kenneth James Parks ends not in horror but in hush, a life once broken by an act he could not remember, mended slowly, year after year, through the simple labor of staying awake to himself. His name began as a headline, a symbol of fear, but it faded into something quieter, a reminder that even in the strangest corners of human nature, grace still waits for those who seek it. You picture him now, that small house by the lake, its windows glinting like tired eyes. The lamp still burns faintly in the corner, not out of fear anymore, but out of habit, a soft star marking the distance between darkness and rest. The lake outside breathes like something alive, waves lapping against the shore, as if keeping time with his heart long after it stopped. The world has moved on, as it always does, but the story lingers, not the crime, not the trial, but the quiet endurance of a man who refused to stop waking. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the whisper of his final words, carried somewhere in that cold Canadian wind: "Stay here, stay awake," a mantra for anyone who has ever feared their own mind. So tonight, as you lie back and let the air cool around you, remember, consciousness is fragile, but awareness is a kind of forgiveness. Let the story fade now, as all stories must, until only the sound of breath remains, slow and steady, steady and slow. And then, like a candle going out, the night exhales, and everything grows still.